He was no king before this oath, and so it was a fractional oath between him and the kingdom upon terms according to the law, Deuteronomy 17. He was only a king in Sarai, one who was to be king, but now actually inaugurate a covenanted king upon terms that sanctified them. It is true they came to recognizance Rehoboam's right, and came to Shechem to make him king, 1 Kings 12, verse 1. And yet when he would not enter in covenant terms with them to satisfy their just demands, the people answered the king, saying, What portion have we in David? Neither have we inheritance in the son of Jesse to your tents, O Israel. Verse 16. They refused to acknowledge such an usurper, and we find no prophets ever condemning them for it. So, when Joash was crowned, Jehoiada made a covenant between the Lord and the king and the people, between the king also and the people. 2 Kings 11, verse 17, and 2 Chronicles 23, verses 11 and 16. From all these reasons in Scriptures, it is clear there must be a mutual compact between the subjects and every sovereign they own subjection to, which, if he refuse and usurp the sword, they are under in an anterior obligation to subtract their allegiance and to make use of their sword, if they be in capacity to pull it out of his hands and use it against him. And of this we are put in mind by the motto of our old coronation pieces, which have these words about the sword, quote, For me, but if I deserve, against me, unquote. And surely to him that hath it now in his hands it may be said, Thou hast deserved, and as yet deserves. We see then the allegiance that this usurper alleges in his due wants a bottom, to wit, a compact with the people. Whence I argue, if there must be of necessity a compact between king and the people, when he is advanced to the government, then he that advances himself without and against this compact is an usurper not to be owned. But the former is true, therefore he that advances himself without and against this compact is an usurper not to be owned. And who more notoriously deserving such a signature than James the Seventh, James the Second, who hath made horns of his own strength, or the Pope's bulls, to push his brother out and himself into the throne, upon no terms at all, or any security for religion and liberty? One objection is to be removed here. Can the customs of the Jews be binding to all nations? The kings of Judah made such covenants. Shall therefore all kings do so? Answer. Why not this custom as well as crowning, which they used likewise? These rules are not typical or ceremonial, nor only so judicial as to be peculiarly judicial, but are matters of moral equity, bearing a standing reason, founded upon that law. Deuteronomy 17, verse 15, etc., limiting the prince to stand to conditions. If we cast at divine laws for rules of government, where will we find better laws? It is recorded of the first of the British kings, who was Christian, that writing to Eleutherius, bishop of Rome, before Antichrist took that seat, for the Roman laws, he received this answer, quote, By divine clemency ye have received the law and faith of Christ. You have the Old and New Testaments. Out of them, in God's name, by counsel of your states, take laws, and govern your kingdom, unquote. And of another, that he began his laws thus, God spake all these words, etc., and so repeated the laws of God. The second thing I undertook to prove is that assertion of Buchanan, ubi supra de jure regina, quote, there being a paction between the king and the subjects. He who first recedes from what is covenanted and doth counteract what he hath covenanted, he looses the contract, and the bond being loosed, which did hold fast the king with the people, whatever right did belong to him by virtue of that compact, he looses it, and the people are as free as before the stipulation, unquote. Which is also asserted by the author of Jus Populi, chapter 6, page 112. Quote, It is no less clear that when the sovereign doth not perform the principal, main, and most necessary conditions, condescended and agreed upon, by right he falleth from his sovereignty, and, page 117, when the prince doth violate his compact as to all its conditions, or as to its chief, main, and most necessary condition, the subjects are by right free from subjection to him, and at liberty to make choice of another, unquote. This is so clear that it needs no labor to prove it, that upon this head we were loosed from all allegiance to the former tyrant, who was admitted upon terms of an explicit covenant, the conditions whereof he did as explicitly break. There are two cases wherein subjects are loosed from covenanted allegiance to their princes. First, when the prince remits the obligation of the subjects and refuses allegiance upon that basis, then he can no more demand it by virtue of that compact. He that remits and will not have that allegiance, that the subjects covenanted upon such and such conditions to him, these subjects should not give it that they so covenanted, for they should not prostitute it to a refuser and remitter. But Charles II remitted and would not have that allegiance, which we covenanted upon such and such conditions, that is, upon the terms of the covenant, which he cast and annulled and made criminal to own. Therefore to him we should not have given it, which we so covenanted. And second, when the prince doth enter into a mutual covenant with the people upon mutual conditions, and does not only cease to perform the conditions, but simply denies all obligation to it, and makes it a quarrel to insinuate so much, yea, persecutes all who dare assert the obligation of that covenant, and yet demands allegiance, not upon the obligation of that covenant which he hath remitted, but absolutely upon the grounds of his prerogative. In this case it will be evident also the subjects are not bound either to own their formerly covenanted allegiance to him, or that which he demands on other grounds. Grotius de jure belli is clear as to this. Quote, if there be such a clause or condition in the very devolution of the government upon a prince, as if he do so and so, the subject shall be loosed from all bonds of obedience. Then, when he does so, he becomes a mere private person. Unquote. Grotius there supposes the power is transferred upon a resolute condition, that is, if he transgress the condition, the power shall be resolved into its first fountain. Much more if it be transferred expressly upon a suspensive condition, that he shall continue to maintain the ends of the covenant, defend religion and the liberty of the subjects, in the defense whereof we shall own allegiance to him, otherwise not. In that case, if he do not maintain these ends, plain it is our obligation ceases. For how can it stand upon a conditional obligation when his performance of the condition ceases? But whatever by the conditions mutual, it flows natively from the nature of a mutual compact, quote, that he who doth not perform the conditions agreed upon hath no right to the benefit granted upon condition of performance of these conditions, especially if he perform not, nor violate these conditions upon supposition whereof he would not have gotten the benefit. It were very absurd to say in a mutual conditional compact, one party shall still be found to perform his conditions, though the other perform none, but break all. Were it the act of rational creatures to set up a sovereign upon conditions he shall not play the tyrant, and yet be bound to him, though he tyrannize never so much. We have the nature of mutual compacts in the spy's covenant with Rahab, Joshua 2:20, quote, if thou utter this our business, then we will be quit of thine oath, which thou hast made us swear. Unquote. If she should break condition, then the obligation on their part should cease. But next, all the stress will lie in proving that the covenant on such and such conditions between a prince and subjects doth equally and mutually oblige both to each other. For if it equally oblige both, then both are equally disengaged from the other by the breach of either side, and either of them may have a just claim in law against the other for breach of the conditions. But royalists and court slaves allege that such a covenant obliges the king to God, but not to the people at all, for that he is no more accountable to them than if he had none at all. But the contrary is evident, for, number one, if the compact be mutual, and if it be infringed on one side, it must be so in the other also. For in contracts the parties are considered as equals, whatever inequality there may be betwixt them otherwise. I speak of contracts among men. Secondly, if it be not so, there is no covenant made with the people at all, and so David did no more covenant with Israel than with the Chaldeans. For to all with whom the covenant is made, it obliges them to it. Otherwise it must be said, he only made the covenant with God, contrary to the text. For he made it only before the Lord as a witness, not with him as a party. Joash's covenant with the Lord is expressly distinguished from that with the people. Thirdly, if it be not so, it were altogether nonsense to say there were any covenant made with the king on the other hand. For he is supposed to be made king on such and such terms, and yet by this, after he is made king, he is no more obliged unto them than if there had been no compact with him at all. Fourth, if he be bound as king, and not only as a man or Christian, then he is bound with respect to the people. For with respect to them he is only king, but he is bound as king, and not only as a man or Christian, because it is only with him as king that the people covenant, and he must transact with them under the same consideration. Next, that which he is obliged to is a specifical act of a king, to defend religion and liberty and rule in righteousness, and therefore his covenant binds him as king. Again, if he be not bound as king, then as a king he is under no obligation of law or oath, which is to make him a lawless tyrant, yea, none of God's subjects. It would also suppose that the king as king could not sin against the people at all, but only against God. For as king he could be under no obligation of duty to the people, and where there is no obligation, there is no sin. By this he would be set above all obligations to love his neighbor as himself, for he is above all his neighbors and all mankind, and only less than God. And so by this doctrine he is loosed from all duties of the second table, or at least he is not so much obliged to them as others. But against this it is objected, both prince and people are obliged to perform their part to each other, and both are obliged to God. But both are not accountable to each other. There is not mutual power in the parties to compel one another to perform the promised duty. The king hath it indeed over the people, but not the people over the king. There is no indifferent judge superior to both, to compel both, but God. Answer number 1. What if all this should be granted, yet it doth not infringe the proposition? What if the people had not power to compel him? Yet if by law he may fall from his sovereignty, though, indeed, he is not deposed, he loses his right to our part when he breaks his part. Secondly, there is no need of a superior arbiter, for as in contracting they are considered as equal, so the party keeping the contract is superior to the other breaking it. Thirdly, there may be mutual coactive power, where there is no mutual relation of superiority and inferiority. Yea, in some cases inferiors may have a coactive power by law, to compel their superiors failing in their duty to them, as a son wronged by his father may compel him to reparation by law and independent kingdoms, nothing inferior to each other. Being in covenant together, the wronged may have a coactive power to force the other to duty without any superior arbiter. Fourthly, the bond of suretyship brings a man under the obligation to be accountable to the creditor, though the surety were never so high and the creditor never so low. Solomon says, in general, without exception of kings, yea, including them, because he was a king that spake it, Proverbs 6, verses 1 and 2, quote, My son, if thou be surety for thy friend, thou art snared with the words of thy mouth, unquote. Now a king's power is but fiduciary, and therefore he cannot be unaccountable for the power concredited to him. And if this generation had minded this, our stewards would have been called to an account for their stewardship ere now. Hence I argue, if a covenanted prince, breaking all the conditions of his compact, doth forfeit his right to the subjects' allegiance, then they are no more to own him as their sovereign, but the former is proved, that a covenanted prince, breaking all the conditions of his compact, doth forfeit his right to the subjects' allegiance. Therefore, and consequently, when Charles II, expressly bound by covenant to defend and promote the covenanted Reformation and liberties of the kingdom, to whom only we were bound in the terms of his defending and promoting the same, did violently and villainously violate and vilify these conditions, we were no more bound to them. Somewhat possibly may be objected here. Firstly, if this be the sense of the covenant, then it would seem that we were not bound to own the king, but only when and while he were actually promoving and carrying on the ends of the covenant. Answer: it does not follow but that we were obliged to preserve formally his person and authority in these necessary intervals, when he is called to see to himself as a man, for we must preserve him as a mean, because of his aptitude and designation for such an end, albeit not always formally prosecuting it. We do not say that we are never to own him, but when actually exercised in prosecuting these ends. But we say we are never to own him when he is tyrannically and treacherously abusing his authority for destroying and overturning these ends, and violating all the conditions of his compact.